Sarah Martinez had always been good with numbers. Growing up in a small Texas town where Friday night football was religion and military service was honor, she found her calling in the precise world of logistics and supply chains. When she enlisted in the Army at 19, her recruiters painted a picture of organized warehouses, computer screens, and the satisfaction of keeping soldiers fed and equipped from behind the lines. The reality at Forward Operating Base Kestrel in Afghanistan was close enough to that vision to keep her content. As a supply specialist, Sarah spent her days in climate-controlled trailers, tracking inventory on ruggedized laptops, coordinating with contractors, and ensuring that everything from ammunition to toilet paper reached the right units at the right time. The closest she came to combat was the occasional rocket attack that sent everyone scrambling to bunkers, where she would wait out the all-clear while mentally reviewing tomorrow's supply manifests. Her battle gear collected dust in her footlocker. The M4 rifle issued to every soldier hung clean and barely used in her quarters. During monthly weapons training, she qualified adequately but without enthusiasm. Combat wasn't her job, and she was fine with that arrangement. Let the infantry soldiers do what they trained for while she did what she was good at. The other soldiers respected her work. In a war zone, the person who ensured your unit received body armor that actually fit, meals that weren't expired, and ammunition that matched your weapons became something of a guardian angel. Sarah took pride in anticipating needs before they became emergencies. When Alpha Company mentioned their night vision batteries were running low, she had replacements ready 2 days early. When Bravo Company's medic worried about running short on morphine auto-injectors, Sarah had already expedited a shipment from Bagram. Her daily routine rarely varied. Morning formation at 0630, breakfast in the mess hall, then 8 to 10 hours managing the intricate dance of military logistics. The base felt secure, surrounded by concrete barriers, razor wire, and watchtowers manned by soldiers whose job was fighting. Sarah's world was purchase orders, shipping manifests, and inventory spreadsheets. That sense of security began to crack during her 4th month at Kestrel. Intelligence reports mentioned increased insurgent activity in the surrounding valleys, but Sarah paid little attention. Increased activity meant increased supply needs, which meant more work for her, but nothing that would pull her away from her trailers and computer screens. The first real warning came when her supply convoy was delayed 3 days due to what the reports euphemistically called route security concerns. Sarah found herself rationing certain items for the first time, carefully calculating whether the remaining stock of medical supplies could stretch until the convoy arrived. The delayed shipment made her realize how thin the margin of safety really was, how quickly a secure base could become isolated. 2 weeks later, a helicopter made an emergency landing just outside the base perimeter. Sarah watched from her trailer window as medical teams rushed to assist the crew. Later, she learned that the aircraft had taken small arms fire and sustained engine damage, forcing the pilots to set down in the nearest clear area they could find. The incident felt distant and abstract, just another reminder that dangerous things happened out there. Beyond the protective walls of the base, Sarah's commander, Captain Rodriguez, began requiring all personnel to carry their weapons and wear body armor outside the administrative buildings. The change annoyed Sarah more than it worried her. The additional weight made her job more cumbersome, and the body armor was hot and uncomfortable in the Afghan sun. She complained good-naturedly to her fellow logistics specialists about having to dress like an infantry soldier when her biggest threat was carpal tunnel syndrome from too much typing. The night attacks started small. A few mortar rounds lobbed over the perimeter walls, causing more noise than damage. Sarah would roll out of her bunk, grab her helmet and body armor, and shuffle to the nearest bunker with everyone else. The attacks usually lasted less than an hour, followed by an all-clear and a return to normal routine. After the third such incident, Sarah began bringing a book to the bunker, figuring she might as well use the time productively. Her attitude began shifting when she realized the attacks weren't random harassment. Someone was studying the base, probing for weaknesses. The mortar rounds were falling closer to critical infrastructure with each attack. During one incident, shrapnel damaged the primary generator, forcing the base to switch to backup power for 2 days. Another round destroyed part of the motor pool, taking 3 vehicles out of service. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the security briefings that had once seemed irrelevant to her work. She learned about insurgent tactics, about how they would test defenses before launching larger attacks. The briefings mentioned increased chatter on intercepted communications, suggesting something bigger was being planned. Despite the growing tension, Sarah's job remained the same. Soldiers still needed food, ammunition, and equipment. If anything, her work became more critical as the security situation deteriorated. Damaged equipment needed rapid replacement, and units required additional supplies to maintain heightened alert levels. Sarah worked longer hours, coordinating with suppliers and transportation units to ensure critical items reached the base despite the increasingly dangerous routes. The transformation began subtly. Sarah started checking her weapon more frequently, ensuring it was clean and ready even though she had no expectation of using it. She found herself studying the base layout with new eyes, noting escape routes and defensive positions she had never considered before. During her off-duty hours, she gravitated toward conversations with the infantry soldiers, asking questions about tactics and procedures that had never interested her before. 3 days before everything changed, Sarah received an unusual request from her supply system. A remote observation post, call sign Overlook, needed an emergency resupply of medical equipment and communications gear. The post, located on a mountainside 15 kilometers from the main base, had been established to provide early warning of insurgent movement in the valley. Normally, such deliveries were handled by ground convoy or helicopter, but both options had become increasingly risky. The request sat in Sarah's inbox like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Overlook was critically low on supplies, but getting materials to them would require creativity and careful coordination. As she studied the logistics requirements, Sarah had no idea that her solution would place her directly in the path of the largest insurgent assault the region had seen in months. The plan she developed seemed routine enough. A helicopter would deliver the supplies to a landing zone 5 kilometers from Overlook, where a small ground team would collect them for the final approach to the observation post. Sarah's job was to prepare the supply bundles and ensure they reached the helicopter on schedule. It was the kind of routine logistics operation she had handled dozens of times before. But this time would be different. The morning of the supply run dawned clear and cold, with visibility stretching for miles across the Afghan mountains. Sarah had spent the previous evening preparing the supply bundles for Overlook, carefully packing medical supplies, radio batteries, and replacement parts for their communications equipment. Each item was wrapped, labeled, and secured according to strict protocols that ensured nothing would be damaged during transport. At 0500 hours, Sarah loaded the supplies onto a cargo truck for transport to the helicopter landing zone within the base perimeter. The UH-60 Blackhawk was already spinning up when she arrived, its rotor wash creating a whirlwind of dust and debris. The crew chief, Sergeant First Class Johnson, helped her secure the cargo nets containing the precious supplies that would keep Overlook operational. For another month, everything proceeded according to plan until Captain Rodriguez approached with an unexpected addition to the mission. The observation post's communications specialist, Corporal Davidson, had reported equipment malfunctions that couldn't be diagnosed remotely. Someone with technical expertise needed to accompany the supplies to help restore full communications capability. The base's usual electronics specialists were either on leave or assigned to other critical tasks. Sarah had demonstrated unusual aptitude with communications equipment during her cross-training exercises, and she was already familiar with the specific gear being delivered to Overlook. Captain Rodriguez asked if she would accompany the flight to provide technical support. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. This represented her first opportunity to contribute directly to a combat mission, to do something beyond the routine but vital work of supply management. The observation post was crucial for early warning of insurgent movements, and their communications equipment was their lifeline to the main base. Without working radios, the soldiers at Overlook would be isolated and vulnerable. After a brief hesitation, Sarah agreed to join the mission. She returned to her quarters to collect her combat gear, strapping on body armor that suddenly felt heavier and more significant than it had during routine base activities. Her M4 rifle, cleaned and maintained but rarely carried, felt awkward in her hands as she performed final equipment checks. The helicopter lifted off at 6:30 hours, carrying Sarah on her first flight beyond the secure perimeter of forward operating base Kestrel. Through the aircraft's small windows, she watched the landscape change from the heavily fortified base to the wild, mountainous terrain that surrounded them. The pilot followed a route designed to avoid known threat areas, But Sarah understood that no flight path in Afghanistan was completely safe. Overlook perched on a rocky outcrop that provided commanding views of 3 valley approaches. The observation post consisted of several reinforced positions connected by communication trenches, with solar panels and antenna arrays that enabled the 6-soldier team to monitor insurgent radio traffic and report movement to higher headquarters. As the helicopter approached the landing zone, Sarah could see the soldiers emerging from their positions to assist with unloading. The landing zone was a natural clearing about 200 meters below the observation post itself. The helicopter touched down long enough for Sarah and the supplies to be offloaded, then immediately departed to minimize its exposure to potential ground fire. Sarah found herself standing in the thin mountain air, surrounded by cargo bundles and facing a steep climb to reach the soldiers who needed her help. Staff Sergeant Williams, the observation post leader, greeted Sarah with professional courtesy tinged with surprise. Female soldiers were uncommon in forward positions, and supply specialists were even rarer. Sarah quickly explained her mission and demonstrated her familiarity with the communications equipment that needed repair. Williams assigned 2 soldiers to help carry the supplies up the mountain, while he escorted Sarah to the communications bunker. The equipment problems were more complex than the initial reports had suggested. The primary radio antenna had been damaged by recent windstorms, and water infiltration had corroded several critical connections. Sarah spent 4 hours diagnosing problems, replacing components and realigning antenna elements. The work required her to move between several positions within the observation post, giving her a first-hand view of how the soldiers lived and worked in their isolated mountain fortress. These soldiers operated with a level of alertness that was foreign to Sarah's base experience. Every movement beyond the protected positions was calculated and coordinated. Soldiers maintained constant watch in multiple directions, scanning the valleys below for signs of enemy activity. Radio checks occurred every 30 minutes, and the team maintained detailed logs of every vehicle, person, or unusual activity observed in their sector. Sarah began to understand the critical nature of the early warning mission. From their elevated position, the observation post could see insurgent movements hours before they threatened the main base or Allied convoys. The intelligence they gathered saved lives and prevented attacks, but their effectiveness depended entirely on reliable communications with headquarters. By afternoon, Sarah had restored most of the communications capability, but one critical component remained damaged beyond field repair. The backup radio system was functional, but it lacked the range and encryption capabilities needed for secure communications with distant units. Without the primary system, Overlook's effectiveness was severely compromised. The solution required a replacement part that hadn't been included in the original supply bundle. Sarah contacted the main base via the restored communications link and requested immediate delivery of the needed component. The response was discouraging. Weather conditions had deteriorated throughout the region, grounding helicopters until the following morning at the earliest. Staff Sergeant Williams faced a difficult decision. He could maintain the observation post with degraded communications, accepting increased risk to his team and reduced capability to provide early warning. Alternatively, he could temporarily abandon the position and return to the main base, leaving a critical gap in the valley's surveillance coverage at a time when intelligence suggested increased insurgent activity. Sarah found herself involved in a tactical discussion that would have been unthinkable during her routine supply duties. Her technical expertise made her opinion valuable in assessing the communication situation, and her knowledge of supply procedures helped evaluate options for obtaining the replacement component. For the first time in her military career, Sarah was contributing directly to combat decision-making. The decision became academic when Corporal Martinez, manning the southern observation post, reported movement in the valley below. Through binoculars, Sarah could see vehicles moving along what should have been an empty mountain road. The convoy was traveling without lights, using tactics designed to avoid detection. Staff Sergeant Williams immediately began reporting the sighting to headquarters while his soldiers prepared for possible contact. Sarah realized that her routine supply mission had placed her at the center of what might be the prelude to a major attack. The observation post's primary purpose was to provide exactly this type of early warning, but their ability to coordinate the response was limited by the communications problems she had been sent to resolve. Over the next hour, Additional reports confirmed that insurgent forces were moving toward positions that would threaten both the main base and several Allied outposts in the region. The damaged communications equipment prevented Overlook from providing detailed intelligence about the size and composition of the enemy force, information that would be critical for planning an effective response. As evening approached, Sarah found herself helping to prepare defensive positions rather than packing for a return flight to base. The helicopter that was supposed to extract her remained grounded by weather, and the tactical situation made any ground movement extremely dangerous. She was no longer a visiting supply specialist but a temporary member of the observation post's garrison. Staff Sergeant Williams assigned Sarah to assist with communications duties, a role that would keep her in the most protected bunker, while utilizing her technical skills. However, Sarah could see that every soldier in the small outpost would likely be needed if the insurgents discovered their position and decided to eliminate the observation capability before launching their main attack. That night, Sarah lay in a sleeping bag borrowed from one of the other soldiers, listening to radio traffic that painted an increasingly serious picture of enemy activity throughout the region. The routine supply mission that had brought her to this mountain had evolved into something she had never trained for or expected to face. Tomorrow would test whether her months of routine logistics work had prepared her for the reality of combat. Dawn brought no relief to the soldiers at Overlook. Throughout the night, radio intercepts had revealed coordinated insurgent movements across multiple valleys, suggesting a large-scale operation was imminent. Sarah had spent the dark hours learning to operate the observation post's sophisticated surveillance equipment, her supply specialist background proving surprisingly useful in understanding the complex systems that kept the outpost operational. The morning briefing painted a grim picture. Intelligence indicated that insurgent forces had surrounded several Allied positions, including the main supply route between forward operating base Kestrel and the regional headquarters. The enemy had demonstrated unusual coordination and tactical sophistication, suggesting involvement by experienced foreign fighters who understood military procedures and communications. Staff Sergeant Williams received orders to maintain position and continue providing intelligence reports, despite the communications limitations. The observation post had become even more critical, as other surveillance assets were compromised or forced to relocate. Sarah's technical knowledge proved invaluable, as she worked to squeeze maximum performance from the damaged equipment, finding creative ways to extend communication range and improve signal clarity. Around 0800 hours, Corporal Martinez spotted movement on the ridgeline approximately 1,000 meters to the east. Through the spotting scope, Sarah could see armed figures moving with the deliberate caution of trained fighters. They were approaching along a route that would bring them within direct observation of the outpost, potentially compromising the Americans' hidden position. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Instead of being passive observers of insurgent activity in the distant valleys, the soldiers at Overlook now faced the possibility of direct contact with enemy forces. Staff Sergeant Williams began implementing immediate action drills, positioning his 5 soldiers to defend the observation post while maintaining their intelligence-gathering mission. Sarah found herself assigned to the communications bunker with orders to maintain contact with headquarters while the other soldiers prepared fighting positions. Her role was to coordinate fire support and medical evacuation if the situation deteriorated, but everyone understood that 6 soldiers could not hold the position indefinitely against a determined attack. The enemy force consisted of approximately 15 fighters who had apparently discovered tracks leading to the observation post. Their movements suggested they were conducting a deliberate reconnaissance, trying to determine the exact location and strength of the American position. Staff Sergeant Williams faced a critical decision: engage the enemy force while maintaining some element of surprise, or wait for them to reveal their intentions. Sarah listened to increasingly urgent radio traffic as the tactical situation across the region continued to deteriorate. 2 other observation posts had been attacked and forced to withdraw, leaving significant gaps in the early warning network. A convoy attempting to reach an isolated outpost had been ambushed, suffering multiple casualties. The insurgents were executing a coordinated campaign designed to blind Allied forces before launching their main assault. The decision was made for them when the enemy force began moving directly toward the observation Post primary position. Staff Sergeant Williams gave the order to engage, hoping to drive off the attackers before they could call for reinforcements. The first exchange of gunfire shattered the mountain silence and transformed Sarah's world completely. From the communications bunker, Sarah could hear the sharp crack of M4 rifles answered by the distinctive sound of AK-47s. The carefully maintained routines of observation post operations collapsed into the chaos of close combat. Radio procedures became urgent. Abbreviated transmissions as soldiers reported enemy positions and requested immediate fire support. Sarah's training had covered basic combat communications, but the reality proved far more complex and stressful than any exercise. Multiple radio networks demanded attention simultaneously as she coordinated with artillery units, close air support, and medical evacuation assets. Her voice remained steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her analytical mind. The initial engagement lasted 20 minutes before the attackers withdrew to covered positions. 3 insurgents had been confirmed killed, but the remaining fighters had established positions that prevented the Americans from observing large sections of the surrounding terrain. Worse, radio intercepts suggested that additional enemy forces were moving toward the observation post's location. During the brief lull, Sarah helped treat Specialist Peterson, who had sustained a minor wound from rock fragments thrown up by enemy gunfire. Her medical training was basic, but in the isolated outpost, every person with any medical knowledge was valuable. As she bandaged Peterson's arm, Sarah realized that her role had fundamentally changed from technical support to active participant in combat operations. Staff Sergeant Williams called for immediate extraction, but the tactical situation made helicopter operations extremely dangerous. Enemy forces now controlled several high positions that could threaten aircraft approaching the observation post. The nearest friendly ground units were engaged in their own firefights and couldn't provide assistance for several hours at minimum. Sarah found herself calculating ammunition, consumption rates, and medical supply requirements with the same analytical approach she had once applied to routine logistics problems. The observation post had sufficient ammunition for an extended firefight, but food and water would become critical issues if they remained isolated for more than 48 hours. Medical supplies were adequate for treating minor wounds but insufficient for serious casualties. The second attack began at noon with mortar fire that forced everyone into the deepest bunkers. Sarah discovered that her communications equipment was particularly vulnerable to the concussive effects of nearby explosions. Maintaining radio contact required constant adjustments and repairs as connections loosened and antenna elements shifted. Her technical expertise became essential for preserving the outpost's lifeline to outside support. Between mortar rounds, Sarah could hear Staff Sergeant Williams coordinating the defense with calm professionalism that masked the desperate nature of their situation. The enemy force had grown to an estimated 30 fighters supported by crew-served weapons. They were conducting a methodical assault, designed to overwhelm the small garrison through superior numbers and firepower. Sarah's role evolved throughout the afternoon as the tactical situation demanded flexibility from every defender. She alternated between maintaining communications, treating wounded soldiers, and distributing ammunition to fighting positions. Her supply background proved invaluable in managing the outpost's diminishing resources while ensuring that critical items reached the soldiers who needed them most. The serious moment came when a mortar round severed the primary antenna cable, threatening to cut off communications with headquarters completely. Sarah volunteered to repair the connection, which required leaving the protected bunker and exposing herself to enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Williams initially refused, but Sarah argued that her technical knowledge made her the only person capable of making the repairs quickly. The 50-meter movement to the antenna array became the longest journey of Sarah's life. Enemy snipers had positioned themselves to cover the open areas around the observation post, and bullets struck the ground nearby as she crawled between covered positions. Her hands shook as she spliced the severed cable, but her mind remained focused on the technical requirements of the repair. When communications were restored, Sarah found herself coordinating a complex fire support mission that would determine the outpost's survival. Artillery units at the main base were prepared to engage the enemy positions, but accurate target information was essential to avoid hitting the American defenders. Sarah's precise technical descriptions and clear communication under pressure enabled the fire support that broke the enemy assault. As evening approached, the immediate threat to the observation post had been neutralized, but Sarah understood that her transformation from supply specialist to combat soldier was irreversible. She had discovered capabilities within herself that peacetime training had never revealed, and she had contributed directly to her unit's survival in ways that no logistics manual had ever described. The night would bring new challenges as enemy forces regrouped and the larger battle continued to develop across the region. Sarah's routine supply mission had become a crucible that would test every aspect of her training, character, and determination. Tomorrow would reveal whether her newly discovered warrior spirit could sustain her through even greater trials. The night sky over the observation post flickered with distant muzzle flashes as battles raged across the mountain valleys. Sarah had volunteered for the midnight watch, her newly acquired combat experience making her a valuable addition to the defense roster. Through night vision equipment, she could see enemy forces moving in the darkness, probing for weaknesses in the American position while avoiding the areas where afternoon artillery strikes had devastated their comrades. Radio traffic painted an increasingly desperate picture throughout the region. 3 forward operating bases were under sustained attack, and several convoy routes had been completely severed by coordinated ambushes. The insurgents had achieved tactical surprise on a scale not seen since the early days of the conflict, suggesting months of careful planning and preparation. Sarah's communication skills had become essential for coordinating the defense as Staff Sergeant Williams juggled multiple radio networks. She had learned to prioritize transmissions based on tactical urgency, while maintaining the detailed intelligence reports that headquarters needed to understand the scope of the enemy offensive. Her clear, precise communication style proved perfectly suited to the high-stress environment of combat operations. Around 0200 hours, thermal imaging detected a large enemy force moving toward the observation post from the northwest. The approaching fighters numbered at least 50, supported by heavy weapons and what appeared to be improvised explosive devices. This represented a much more serious threat than the probing attacks of the previous day, suggesting that the insurgents had decided to eliminate the observation post as part of their larger offensive. The tactical situation forced difficult decisions about resource allocation and risk management. The observation post's elevated position provided excellent defensive advantages, but the small garrison lacked sufficient ammunition for an extended battle against a numerically superior enemy. Staff Sergeant Williams requested immediate reinforcement and resupply, but all available assets were committed to defending higher priority targets. Sarah found herself involved in planning the defense, her analytical skills contributing to decisions about ammunition distribution, casualty evacuation procedures, and communication protocols. She had never imagined that her background in supply chain management would prove relevant to tactical planning. But the principles of resource optimization and contingency planning applied equally well to combat operations. The Chaos pre-dawn attack began with rocket-propelled grenades that bracketed the observation post's primary positions. Sarah crouched in the communications bunker as explosions shook the mountain, trying to maintain radio contact, while rock and debris rained down from the ceiling. The enemy had learned from their previous failures and was employing more sophisticated tactics designed to neutralize the Americans' defensive advantages. Between artillery barrages, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of multiple machine guns as the insurgents established fire superiority over large sections of the observation post. The American defenders responded with disciplined fire and tactical movement, but everyone understood that they were gradually being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The critical moment came when Corporal Martinez was seriously wounded by shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade. The injury required immediate medical attention that exceeded the capabilities of the observation post's basic first aid supplies. Sarah found herself serving as both medic and communications operator, coordinating a medical evacuation while treating life-threatening injuries with limited equipment and training. Her hands shook as she applied pressure bandages and administered morphine, but her voice remained steady as she provided precise medical reports to the evacuation helicopter. The pilot needed detailed information about landing zone conditions, enemy activity, and the patient's status to determine whether the rescue mission was feasible. Under combat conditions at staff, Sergeant Williams made the painful decision to abandon the primary observation positions, and consolidate the defense around the communications bunker. This tactical withdrawal preserved the garrison's fighting strength while maintaining their most critical capability, but it also surrendered much of the high ground that had made their position so valuable for intelligence gathering. Sarah's role became even more crucial as the compressed defense required seamless coordination between fighting positions, fire support assets, and medical evacuation resources. She managed 4 different radio networks simultaneously, maintaining contact with headquarters while coordinating close air support missions that would determine the outpost survival. The helicopter extraction of Corporal Martinez required extraordinary courage from both the flight crew and the ground defenders. Enemy fire damaged the aircraft's tail rotor as it lifted off, forcing an emergency landing at the main base. Sarah's precise communication during the evacuation had enabled the rescue, but the incident demonstrated the extreme danger faced by anyone attempting to reach the isolated observation post. As dawn broke, the insurgent assault intensified with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Sarah realized that the enemy had committed significant resources to eliminating the observation post, suggesting that their intelligence network had identified its critical importance to Allied defensive operations. The small garrison had become the focus of a much larger battle for control of the mountain. Approaches. The morning brought close air support in the form of attack helicopters that engaged enemy positions with rockets and cannon fire. Sarah served as the primary radio operator for coordinating these strikes, her detailed knowledge of the terrain and precise communication skills enabling pilots to engage targets within dangerous proximity to friendly positions. During one particularly intense exchange, Sarah noticed that the primary radio antenna had been damaged by enemy fire, threatening to cut off communication with the attacking aircraft. Without functioning communications, the close air support mission would become impossible, leaving the observation post defensively exposed. The antenna repair required someone to climb onto the bunker roof under direct enemy fire. Before Staff Sergeant Williams could assign the dangerous task, Sarah had grabbed the necessary tools and began moving toward the damaged equipment. Her months of training had emphasized that communications were her primary responsibility, and she understood that the repair could not wait for a safer opportunity. The survival of the entire garrison depended on maintaining contact with supporting aircraft. The climb to the antenna array took place under intense enemy fire as insurgent marksmen attempted to prevent the repair. Sarah's movements were quick and precise, her technical knowledge enabling rapid diagnosis and correction of the damage. Bullets struck the antenna mounting brackets as she worked, but her focus remained on the mechanical connections that would restore full communication capability. When communications were restored, Sarah found herself directing close air support missions with a level of tactical awareness that surprised even her own teammates. Her analytical mind had absorbed the lessons of 2 days of combat, enabling her to provide pilots with detailed target descriptions and accurate damage assessments that maximized the effectiveness of each attack. Run. The insurgent assault finally broke under sustained air attacks, but Sarah understood that the enemy would regroup and return with different tactics. The observation post had survived its most serious challenge, but the larger battle continued to rage across the region. Her transformation from supply specialist to combat veteran was complete, but greater tests lay ahead. As she helped redistribute ammunition and treat minor wounds sustained during the morning battle, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her military service had changed. 3 days earlier, her biggest concern had been coordinating the delivery of replacement parts. Now she was an integral part of a combat team fighting for survival in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The afternoon brought news that reinforcements were finally approaching the observation post, but Sarah had learned that in combat, situations could change rapidly and dramatically. She continued monitoring multiple radio networks while helping to prepare defensive positions for the night ahead. Her warrior transformation was permanent, forged in the crucible of mountain combat against a determined and capable enemy. Evening approached with the promise of continued fighting, but Sarah no longer feared the coming darkness. She had discovered inner resources of courage and competence that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead in the dangerous mountains of Afghanistan. The reinforcement convoy reached Overlook just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, bringing 12 additional soldiers and desperately needed supplies. Sarah watched the relief force climb the mountain approach, their movements careful and coordinated as they navigated terrain that had been contested by insurgent forces for the past 48 hours. The sight of friendly faces emerging from the darkness provided the first moment of genuine hope she had experienced since the crisis began. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander, had personally led the reinforcement mission to assess the tactical situation and determine the observation post's continued viability. His arrival brought not only additional firepower, but also a broader perspective on the regional battle that had isolated Overlook for 3 critical days. Sarah found herself briefing a senior officer about communications procedures and enemy tactics, her combat experience now making her opinions valuable at levels far above her enlisted rank. The intelligence picture that emerged from Harrison's briefing was sobering. The insurgent offensive had achieved several tactical successes, temporarily cutting major supply routes and forcing the evacuation of 2 smaller outposts. However, the enemy had also suffered significant casualties, particularly during their failed assault on Overlook. The observation post's successful defense had disrupted insurgent plans and provided crucial intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Sarah's role in the defense had not gone unnoticed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison specifically mentioned her communications expertise and tactical adaptability when discussing the factors that had enabled Overlook's survival. Her transformation from supply specialist to combat veteran represented exactly the kind of flexibility and determination that characterized successful soldiers in counterinsurgency operations. The expanded garrison brought new challenges along with increased security. 19 soldiers required more sophisticated coordination and resource management than the original 6-person team. Sarah found herself serving as an informal liaison between the original defenders and the reinforcement unit. Her intimate knowledge of the observation post's systems and procedures, making her essential for integrating the new arrivals. Over the next several days, Overlook evolved from an isolated outpost fighting for survival into a major intelligence gathering center, coordinating operations across multiple valleys. Sarah's communications expertise became the foundation for expanded surveillance capabilities as additional equipment and personnel arrived via helicopter. Her technical skills, sharpened by combat necessity, enabled rapid integration of new systems with existing networks. The broader tactical situation gradually stabilized as Allied forces adapted to insurgent tactics and launched coordinated counterattacks. Sarah monitored radio traffic that described successful engagements across the region, including the recapture of key terrain and the restoration of severed supply routes. The enemy offensive, while initially successful, had ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Sarah's personal transformation continued as she assumed increasing responsibility within the expanded observation post. Staff Sergeant Williams recommended her for advanced communications training, recognizing that her combat experience had revealed capabilities that formal military education had not developed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison endorsed the recommendation, noting that soldiers like Sarah represented the future of adaptive military operations. The psychological impact of combat had affected everyone at Overlook, but Sarah discovered that her analytical temperament provided some protection against the stress and uncertainty of prolonged operations. She found purpose in solving complex technical problems under pressure, and her success in maintaining communications during critical moments had built confidence that extended beyond her specific military occupational specialty. 3 weeks after the initial insurgent assault, Sarah received orders to report to the Regional Communications Center for specialized training in advanced tactical systems. The assignment represented recognition of her proven abilities, but it also meant leaving Overlook and the soldiers who had become her closest military family. The observation post had been the crucible of her transformation, and departing felt like abandoning something essential to her identity. The farewell ceremony was informal but meaningful. Staff Sergeant Williams presented Sarah with a unit patch that had been worn by every soldier who had served at Overlook during the critical battle. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison spoke about soldiers who exceeded their formal duties to serve the broader mission, using Sarah's example to illustrate the importance of individual initiative and adaptability in modern military operations. Sarah's helicopter departure from Overlook provided a final view of the mountain fortress that had changed her life. The observation post continued its mission with upgraded equipment and an expanded garrison, but the essential character of the place remained unchanged. It was a position where dedicated soldiers provided early warning and intelligence support to protect their comrades, regardless of their formal job descriptions or previous experience. The Advanced Communications School at the regional headquarters exposed Sarah to technologies and procedures that would have been incomprehensible before her combat experience. Her instructors noted her unusual combination of technical aptitude and tactical awareness, recognizing that her training at Overlook had provided practical knowledge that classroom instruction could not duplicate. Her questions and insights reflected the perspective of someone who had used communications equipment under the most demanding conditions possible. During her training, Sarah received news that Overlook had successfully directed airstrikes against a major insurgent staging area, preventing another coordinated offensive. The intelligence breakthrough had been made possible by the expanded surveillance capabilities that her technical work had helped establish. Learning about her continued contribution to the mission provided deep satisfaction and confirmed her sense that the combat experience had been meaningful and worthwhile. The completion of her advanced training brought assignment options that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived in Afghanistan as a supply specialist. Sarah could serve with special operations units, train other soldiers in combat communications, or participate in the development of new tactical systems. Each possibility represented recognition of capabilities that had been discovered and developed through unexpected circumstances. Sarah chose assignment to a mobile training team that would travel throughout the region, teaching advanced communications procedures to soldiers at forward positions. The role would enable her to share the lessons learned at Overlook, while continuing to serve in the challenging environment where she had discovered her true potential. Her experience had proven that meaningful military service could come from sources that traditional career planning never anticipated. The transition from supply specialist to communications expert had been completed through a combination of necessity, opportunity, and personal determination. Sarah understood that her military career would never return to the routine predictability that had once characterized her service. She had discovered that her greatest contributions would come from embracing challenges that tested her adaptability and resolve. Her final weeks in Afghanistan were spent preparing for redeployment and transition to her new assignment. Sarah reflected on the dramatic changes that had transformed not only her military occupational specialty, but also her understanding of her own capabilities and potential. The scared supply specialist who had reluctantly boarded a helicopter for a routine technical mission no longer existed, replaced by a confident communications expert who could adapt to any tactical situation. The mountain observation post where she had been forged into a warrior continued its mission. With new soldiers who would face their own tests of courage and adaptability, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that ordinary soldiers could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded excellence and initiative. Her transformation would continue throughout her military career, but its foundation had been established during those crucial days when survival depended on discovering strength she never knew she possessed. 2 years after her deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah Martinez stood before a classroom of young soldiers at Fort Gordon, Georgia, teaching advanced tactical communications to the next generation of military specialists. The transformation that had begun on a mountainside observation post had continued through multiple assignments, advanced schools, and leadership positions that built upon the foundation of combat experience and technical expertise. Her students listened intently as she described real-world scenarios where communications failures had led to tactical disasters and where innovative solutions had saved lives and accomplished missions. Sarah drew from her extensive field experience to illustrate abstract concepts with concrete examples, helping soldiers understand that their technical training served a larger purpose in supporting combat operations. The classroom walls displayed photographs from various deployments, including several images of Overlook during its most critical period. Sarah often used the observation post as a case study in adaptive leadership and technical problem-solving under pressure. Her students found the stories compelling because they came from someone who had lived through the experiences rather than merely studied them in textbooks. Sarah's military career had evolved in directions that would have been unimaginable during her early service. As a supply specialist, she had completed Ranger School, earned a bachelor's degree in communications engineering, and served with special operations units in 3 different combat zones. Each assignment had built upon lessons learned during those crucial days at Overlook, when necessity had forced rapid adaptation and growth. The recognition of her capabilities had come gradually but consistently. Superior officers noted her ability to remain calm under pressure, solve complex technical problems with limited resources, and lead soldiers through difficult circumstances. Her combination of technical expertise and proven combat experience made her valuable for assignments that required both competencies. During a recent deployment to Syria, Sarah had established communications networks that enabled coordination between multiple allied forces operating against terrorist organizations. Her work had been critical for the success of several major operations, and her innovative approaches to technical challenges had been adopted as standard procedures for similar missions. The personal costs of continuous high-tempo operations had been significant. Sarah had missed family gatherings, ended relationships that could not accommodate her demanding schedule, and accumulated stress that required careful management to prevent burnout. However, she had also discovered purpose and satisfaction in military service that extended far beyond conventional career goals. Her expertise had been recognized through selection for the Sergeant Major Academy, where she would prepare for senior leadership positions that combined technical competence with strategic understanding. The assignment represented the pinnacle of enlisted military education and positioned her for roles that would influence military communications policy and doctrine. Sarah's influence extended beyond her formal assignments through mentoring relationships with junior soldiers who sought guidance on career, development, and technical challenges. She particularly enjoyed working with female soldiers who faced similar obstacles to those she had encountered during her own transformation. Her example demonstrated that determination and competence could overcome traditional barriers and stereotypes. The awards and commendations accumulated during her career included the Bronze Star for her actions at Overlook, the Meritorious Service Medal for her work in Syria, and the Army Commendation Medal for her contributions to communications training programs. However, Sarah valued most highly the informal recognition from soldiers whose lives had been impacted by her technical expertise and leadership example. Her family had gradually adapted to her transformed identity, though the transition had not been without difficulties. Her parents, who had expected their daughter to serve a routine enlistment before returning to civilian life, had struggled to understand her commitment to increasingly dangerous assignments. However, they had eventually recognized that military service had become central to her identity and sense of purpose. Sarah's hometown had honored her achievements, with a small ceremony recognizing her contributions to military communications and her role as a positive example for other young people considering military service. The recognition was meaningful because it came from the community where her military journey had begun, with relatively modest expectations and conventional goals. Looking toward the future, Sarah planned to complete her military career in positions that would enable her to influence the development of next-generation communication systems and training programs. Her combat experience provided credibility when advocating for equipment modifications and tactical procedures that would benefit soldiers facing similar challenges to those she had encountered. The observation post at Overlook had been deactivated 2 years after Sarah's departure. Its mission transferred to other surveillance assets as the strategic situation evolved. However, the lessons learned during its most critical period continued to influence military operations and training programs throughout the armed forces. Sarah carried those lessons into every subsequent assignment and shared them with every soldier she had the opportunity to teach or mentor. Her personal philosophy had evolved to emphasize the importance of remaining prepared for unexpected challenges and opportunities. Military service had taught her that careers seldom developed according to initial plans, and that the most meaningful assignments often emerged from circumstances that initially seemed routine or disappointing. Sarah understood that her transformation from supply specialist to combat communications expert had been enabled by the intersection of necessity, opportunity, and personal determination. Other soldiers faced similar crossroads during their military careers, and her example demonstrated that individual choice and effort could shape professional development in remarkable ways. The young soldiers in her current classroom would eventually face their own tests of adaptation and growth, possibly in circumstances as unexpected as those that had transformed Sarah's life. Her teaching emphasized not only technical competence, but also the mental flexibility and moral courage required to excel when normal procedures proved inadequate for extraordinary situations. As she concluded, another day of instruction, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small Texas town to positions of significant responsibility and influence within the military communications community. The scared young woman who had reluctantly joined a routine helicopter mission had evolved into a confident leader whose expertise was sought. For the most challenging assignments, the helicopter that had carried her to Overlook years earlier had been the first step in a transformation that continued to unfold with each new assignment and challenge. Sarah understood that her military career would eventually end, but the lessons learned during those crucial days on a remote mountainside would influence the remainder of her life and the lives of soldiers she would continue to teach and mentor. Her story had become part of the institutional memory of military communications, serving as an example of how individual soldiers could rise to meet extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded excellence. The supply specialist who had once worried about inventory spreadsheets had become a warrior whose technical expertise and tactical knowledge would benefit military operations for years to come.